John, thanks very much for joining us. Just tell us a little bit more about some of the Green City initiatives that you're taking part in, both in terms of the Scottish Cities Alliance, I suppose, but also particularly in Dundee.
As part of the overarching work of the Scottish Cities Alliance, there's some key components to that. The transition to net zero obviously is a focal point for all of us as cities. Key components around that, the development of hydrogen technology, the better use of data in informing some of the decisions that we're going to be making. The development of low emission zones, for example, is another tangible response to the climate emergency. So we're working through that across all of the cities and sharing the experience, both good and bad, to develop our own strategies. Locally in Dundee, we have created and developed our climate action plan, and that isn't just the City Council, it's all of the Dundee partners. So that's private sector, public sector, the universities, NHST side, all of the key partners who have a significant footprint, both in terms of energy usage, but in terms of their kind of mobility aspects, how many cars and vehicles that they're using across Dundee, because that's a huge component of carbon output. So it's really important to us. We're developing our thinking around that, how we collaborate a lot more. So if we are, for example, replacing significant boilers in the university, which is in the centre of Dundee, can we then look at how that can be applied to nearby residences so that we've got some form of district heating system? So really trying to think outside the box about those collaborations, and a key component of that is private sector, and that's why we've been doing some of the innovative work we've been doing with, for example, the Michelin Scotland Innovation Park as well.
That innovation park is really interesting, John. I mean, how did that start, I suppose, and what are the aims for that?
The phrase "Phoenix rising from the ashes" has come to mind a few times. Michelin had a site in Dundee for approximately 50 years, 850 full-time employees, one of the largest employers in the city, a site that is 32 hectares, so fairly significant employer in the city as well. They took the decision to close their facility nearly 2 years ago now, and to kind of scale down the work in the city, and that's very difficult. And usually the approach that Michelin took, they're a fantastic employer and they were very supportive of the workforce, but generally speaking, they would just mothball the site and then put it up for sale. We approached the conversation very differently and started to think about how we look forward. So what is the future of that site, if not tyre manufacturing? Because actually, when you look at their justification, you couldn't really argue against that. We brought in national partners, Scottish Government, the City Council, Scottish Enterprise, and Michelin, of course, to start to have that conversation very early on. And we developed a clear strategy and signed a memorandum of understanding that set out that there was a viable future for this site. And that future was based around mobility, renewable technology, and innovation. And from that point, we've now leveraged in more than sort of £60 million of investment. Bearing in mind, this is an existing site, some first-class facilities. It has 2 wind turbines on the site. It was going to be Michelin's first carbon-neutral site for tyre manufacturing. So there's a lot of good work that had already been delivered there. We're developing a skills academy in conjunction with the academic sector as well. And we've already signed 3 tenants who are leading in their field in terms of electric vehicle technologies and hydrogen as well. So there's a lot there as a mixture of ingredients. And I suppose, I keep saying to people, we've got all the ingredients to make the cake now, and now we've got to drive that agenda forward and make sure it relates to some of the other things that are going on in the city.
And in terms of the wind power, there's a lot of focus on that at the moment. What's happening at the moment in Dundee?
The Port of Dundee has been very active on that front, and the City Council has worked again in partnership. We have no ownership of the port, but we did put in a 6-figure sum to help promote that as a destination for both decommissioning and renewables work. And there's been a real body of steam, I suppose, behind that work. So, over the last couple of years, we've seen success with local companies such as Texo, providing the manufacturing base for the major offshore wind farm that is NNG. We've been in active conversations with Seagreen around the development of another offshore wind farm and how that relates to our work at the Port of Dundee as well. And it's also the manufacturing base for Orbital Marine's first tidal turbine. So there's a lot there going on in the Port of Dundee, much of which people don't necessarily understand or appreciate, but it's the connectivity of the city and proximity to those offshore wind farms. So in terms of our geography, we are uniquely placed to reap the rewards, I suppose, from that industry. You know, we're 90 minutes from 90% of the Scottish population, and we're also situated directly opposite those offshore wind farms on the northeast coast of Scotland. So bringing all those components together, I think we've got quite a unique offering, and we've seen the results of that already, and I hope that that continues to grow as we move forward.
And is the aim here, John, for it to be carbon neutral or to actually be carbon positive, really, and be able to supply, I suppose, both the energy requirements for Dundee, but also further afield?
I think it absolutely has to be about being carbon positive. Clearly, we've got a legislative obligation, I suppose, to become carbon neutral by 2050. But the reality is we want to be ahead of that, significantly so. And the strategies and the relationships that we're starting to build now, particularly with the private sector, are what's going to make the real difference in driving forward that agenda. So the way in which you reduce your carbon and start contributing back is by thinking about things completely differently. So I talked about the Michelin site. We also have the potential there to create green hydrogen, because we've got 2 turbines on site as well. Now, that's a unique asset that isn't necessarily there in other cities. So making sure that we recognise the value of what we've got and where we're willing to take risks in particular. Local authorities can be risk adverse, but I think we've, certainly in a Dundee context, we've taken a significant amount of risk, and I hope that we will see the reward from that in due course as well.
Really interesting to see, John, how the sustainability and the green cities agenda has moved on and been accelerated by the crisis. So really interesting to see how this all develops. But thanks very much for joining us, John.
Thanks, Richard.